policy and practice changes are needed. They are required to make real change. But what is also equally powerful and important is what an individual can do on every single one of his or her case. What are the actionable steps we can do after attending many of these incredible trainings, webinars, symposiums? I know as a parent attorney, along with caseworkers, attorneys for the agency, attorneys for children and judges, we're often asking ourselves, how do we apply what we learn into practice on a daily basis? I would first challenge us to think and say that we have to stop and not only accept that policy changes are valuable and relevant, but that's not enough. And we also have to ask how, as an individual, we can serve the entire family along with their children. That's what child welfare is about. So let me explain how this has become even more clear to me over the past year during this time. Since the murder of George Floyd and so many others, sadly, there has been an array of assessments of the failed policing systems and criminal justice systems. There's been a close examination of data and policies and changes within these systems. And part of the conversation and dialogue was even whether or not this was unique, if George Floyd's murder was only a one-time thing. Are things getting better? How can we improve the system? But as we know, those statements and assessments and those conversations and dialogues mean very little to George Floyd, even after a conviction from a trial, or to his family. Accepting that there is disproportionality in these systems is the first step. Recognizing that we have a lot of work to do is the second step, but it's not enough. It's not enough accepting that things may get better or that there's less children being separated from their families. It's just not enough. There's been incredible strides in New Jersey, no doubt, but we also know that having 3,000 children in foster homes is still too many. One unnecessary separation is unacceptable. One termination of parental or family rights when it could have been avoided is unacceptable. Telling my client that if we were in a different county or before a different judge, things might be different is unacceptable. Fearlessness, which is the subtitle of our talk today, how can we be more fearless in our advocacy for children and families, is wanting to make this change in every case, not accepting that things will get better because of structural program policy changes, but being committed to becoming a professional interrupter. Fearlessness is not waiting on data and policy changes. It's making the change we want to see today. Sorry for all the paper. I'm just realizing it now. Who is a professional interrupter? As I say, I'm calling on all of professional interrupters. My answer is, it's anyone. It's all of you today. Let me first explain what a professional interrupter is not. It's not someone who causes chaos, objects for no reason, likes to hear her own voice. I personally can't stand my voice, but as Lauren Carlton and Clinton Page knows, that doesn't stop me from speaking up. And as Angie described, it's asserting your own voice. As someone who critiques the world, faulty systems, who rejects those who do not want better for the most vulnerable. As someone who refuses to be quiet, who doesn't stop even when they're not invited to the table, having a seat at the table. It's that person who asks, I'm starting my own table, as Angie described in her presentation. It's someone who speaks truth to power. Be the change you wish to see in the world, by Gandhi. Growing up with immigrant parents, my parents would often introduce me or individual strangers to stranger to each other with their name and a long introduction in their title. So for example, it would be, this is Jay, meet Auntie Ronnie, J likes to learn the piano, she's not good at math, and she wants to be a veterinarian. And this would happen all the time to new family members, to the dentist I just met, to my pre-K teacher. I remember this clearly. This explains why I wasn't good at math, and honestly, I still want to become a veterinarian. But doing this work, I found that many cultures and communities with the families I serve and represent practice a similar tradition, providing a long intro or title to people when they introduce them to other individuals. This is a way to describe their strength, worth, and power. And I had a former client from Nigeria who had no immigration status here. We can call her Mary today. And Mary asked me, what was my warrior name? I knew what she meant, and I knew what she was asking and why she was asking me. And I was relieved because I understood that she wanted to know if I was going to fight for her, if I was going to believe her. And I remember saying something like I have here, my name is Jay, I'm a daughter of non-English speaking immigrants. I think I might have thrown that I loved Oprah and Shakespeare, and probably that I still want to be a veterinarian. She was not that impressed, but she got it. She understood me. I, in return, asked her what her warrior name was. And that resulted with her beginning to cry and cry uncontrollably. And she cried for two reasons, as she explained. She said she was never asked in return ever what her warrior name was when she's asked others while living in this country. And two, she said she was no longer a warrior because they took my baby and I'm no longer a mother. And that was my identity. Her baby was removed because of domestic violence she experienced. And her baby was not returned well over a year later because of lack of housing and the delay of getting her immigration status. In court, she was often described as stubborn, narcissistic, pretentious, would likely pick poor partners, other men, other poor choices. She was often described failing to provide for her family, hence the lack of housing, failure to protect her poor choices in men. And psychological evaluations, she was often described as one who would not be able to comply or understand how she's failing her baby. Throughout this year of litigation representation, I would raise the question of warrior name often with her, especially when I saw her starting to fade, when she stopped going to visits and stopped going to treatment provider programs. And once I remember clearly asking her, what's your warrior name, to sort of hype her up before court. And she said, fine, it's Mary, I am broken and the killer of my baby. She did get her baby back, like I said, close to 15 months later. And now she's still doing well. We keep in touch. And her child is doing really well. And they're thriving. And she now says to me, my warrior name is back. It's Mary the mother. I ask my clients what their warrior name is often, especially when I see them beginning to feel less hopeful and starting to hurt. Most recently, with one of my current cases, I'm asked a father what his warrior name after describing what I understood it to be. And he responded with, this reminds me of Game of Thrones. And he loved that. And he rattled off every house of Darius and Targaryen. And I said, yes, that's it. You are the father of dragons. And he said, yes, I am the father of dragons. They're my dragons, and I have to bring them home. Today, you are all warriors because you're pushing past the broken system. You're fighting for the mothers like Mary to be whole. You're supporting families as part of your advocacy. And you're achieving a true child welfare system when you see past the bias and the racism that we all hold in the system. Be a fear fighter. It's a known trauma to separate children from their families. I've sadly observed 2 physical separations in my career, one at court and another at school by the security officers. In both cases, I remember the children were screaming. Their hands and arms tangled together, physically tied together, and they had to be pulled apart. I remember little fingers being held onto the mother's neck and the fingerprints left on my client's neck as they were being pulled apart. And at school, the child almost running into a street, trying to escape the security officer from being separated. Just to note, in both cases, there was no actual physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. One, there was a violation of a safety plan where my client had missed an evaluation twice. And in the other case, the parent was unable to locate housing for over 6 months. To be clear, there are cases where children may need protection from their parents and families. But as we know, the majority of DCPP cases do not go to a litigation or result in a separation. We also know that most of the families involved in the system are coded or identified or alleged with neglect and result in findings of established or not established or even unfounded. And when we go further and unpack this information, we learn that these families are facing situations that are outside of their control: poverty, lack of housing, unstable housing, access to immediate and effective services. We also know that there is known trauma, even in those necessary situations of removal. Research shows that children experience nightmares, depression, and severe anxiety from these separations. Harvard professor of pediatrics, Dr. Charles Nelson, told the Washington Post recently, if people paid attention at all to the science, they would never do this. This being removal. Dr. Nelson is a fear fighter because he's speaking truth to power and taking it into action. Speak the truth. The child welfare system was created in part on structural racism. It exacerbates multi-generational poverty. Now we understand the child welfare system a little bit more. We also need to understand its history and its history related to this country's history and how it's impacted and continued to create biases and racist practices in the system. We know that slavery was a form of family forced separation beginning in the 1600s to the 1800s, forcing separating Black children from their parents, disregarding and destroying Black identity. We're familiar with the 1874 case, the Mary Ellen case, where a child was hurt in foster home after removal from her mother based on poverty and standards of animal protection laws. As we go throughout history, we see that the orphan trains system from 1854 to 1929, where we learned that 250,000 children were separated from their families, sent all over the country, specifically the Midwest, for labor from impoverished and immigrant families from the East Coast. Of course, we know about the Indian boarding schools, where they were created to intentionally destroy the culture and tribal identity. I can go on with history up until even more recent activities. As we know, with policy and legislation, they are just at fault. For example, the war on drugs, Anti-Drug Act, the messaging of crack babies, welfare queens. These policy and messaging that was involved and entwined within these policies and legislation messaged and perpetuated that mothers and fathers from Black and brown communities cannot parent their children safely and are dangerous. And as we know, most recently, we see that this is happening again at the borders when families of color are being deemed unable to protect and care for their children. Dream audaciously. We now know that there is known trauma when you separate a child from their family, and we should do the most we can to avoid that. We can feel good about avoiding that because we also know that the majority of families involved in the system are not abusing their children or neglecting their children in those severe ways that media may narrate. We know that the involvement in the system is often connected to poverty. You're all now been anointed warriors and professional interrupters, and you have the heart and strength to ask for more. Asking at every case, at every intervention, intersection, why is this child separated from their family? Why do they remain in the system as they do? Is there a bias issue? Do I have my own bias issue? What's occurring here? Is this a poverty issue? Can we resolve this? Can we return this child home? Could we prevent this removal? These are things that we're doing at Legal Services and along with other programs across the country with our pre-petition work, where we're providing civil legal assistance to families connected to DCPP to avoid the causes and triggers that result in separation or greater involvement. We're arguing and supporting that if a family receives civil legal assistance that resolves the housing issue, the welfare issue, the unemployment issue, the tax issue, we're uplifting and empowering them so they do not feel exposed or concerned that their children will be removed or be exposed for a reason to believe that their children should be removed. Build your squad. I'm asking you today to include parents in your squad. I'm asking you today to think of those outsiders, those voices that you hear that you can support every day. The mothers like Mary who are found to be unacceptable or believed to make bad choices, to stand up and support them and to be bold when doing so. I will leave you with a story of a CASA professional interrupter and warrior story. A CASA volunteer had reached out to Legal Services in New Jersey several years ago, saying that she's assisting these twin siblings in a foster case, and they're living in a stranger foster home. She said she discovered that there's an adult sister out of New Jersey who has a connection to them and was willing to adopt and take care of them. And she's lovely and wonderful and has lots of family, and this was a Black family and community ready and willing to take care of these two girls. But as she revealed in her call to us, she was told that because this adult daughter had a relationship with their birth mother, whose rights were terminated, that this was not a plausible option, that she was ruled out. Because of her relationship with the birth mother, she was unacceptable for these twin siblings to have a connection with them. She made this call still believing that these twin girls needed connection with their adult sibling. Fast forward several years later, this case went to the Supreme Court in Ray, DC, where a Supreme Court held that siblings remain siblings post-termination of parental rights because it's that important to maintain that sibling connection and family connection. And this was all in part due to this CASA advocate reaching out to us. And I think of her often as being the warrior spirit that we should hold on to every day. So I leave you with that it's not beyond your control, and it only takes one warrior to make real change and impact for our families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. We have a little bit of time for some questions. If there's anyone that would like to chat, put them in the chat. I'm sorry, we don't have chat in the Q&A box. And we'll see how far we can get with that.
Jay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry if I did speak too quickly. I apologize.
No, don't be silly.
Happy to answer questions. If there are any, I would be happy to do so.
One of our attendees asked the question about when counsel is appointed for our parents when they are petitioned for custody, when the agency petitions for custody. And I wrote one quick answer back about the public defender coming in at the time of an initial filing, but maybe you can explain that process better. And especially, perhaps you can explain your program's pre-petition work versus the post-petition advocacy that's available to parents where custody is already sought.
Great, absolutely. So I represent both parents post-petition and pre-petition, but the majority of the families involved post-petition are represented by the Public Defender's Office, OPR. In fact, I believe it's at 95%. And I want to note that suggests that 95% of all families post-removal qualify at the poverty level at the Public Defender's Office. And the remaining percent go to Often Legal Services of New Jersey, and we have a poverty rate. So just to emphasize that these are impoverished families in the system. And so legal services, if we have a case where we're representing them on domestic violence or any other civil legal issue, we'll continue to represent them on the child welfare matter. We also get calls, thousands of calls per year where parents are seeking representation. And that's how we get those cases, separate from the Public Defender's Office. But we do have a system where at the initial hearing, parents fill out a form called a 5A, where they are deemed qualified for the Public Defender's Office, and they'll be assigned an attorney after that qualifying requirement. Now, pre-petition, this is before the agency gets involved. Before there's a removal and separation. And now that's the majority of DCPP involved cases in New Jersey. I believe over 60,000 families have these cases, and they struggle, as I described, with complicated lives and civil legal issues, such as about to be evicted. We've seen that a lot, especially during COVID, even with the moratorium. They're about to lose their housing if it's a shelter or motel. They've been denied health benefits, lost their insurance. Do they qualify for unemployment, educational issues, domestic violence issues? And these are cases that will, when you're involved with these systems, they will also often will bring in the division because there's a concern whether or not they're going to be homeless or if there's going to be a protection or safety issue. But what I've learned in pre-petition, where we get referrals from anyone, but mainly the division, saying, can you please assess and see if their eviction can be resolved, whether or not they qualify for unemployment. And we take on those cases. So we receive these referrals and we do an intake, and we have the family assign counsel who specializes in those legal areas. And I'm happy to report that over the last 3 years, we've had well over 300 cases, and we've not had any removals or separations. So over 500 children have remained safely with their families as we at Legal Services provide them legal assistance to resolve the issues that might have likely resulted in removal in other cases. And that's what we're talking about pre-petition. And in our program, we have social workers, we have 2 parent allies who have lived expertise, who recently have had their children returned. One of our parents actually faced a termination and had her other 2 children return. So she's connected to our families. They're both connected to our families in these cases. We also have interpreters and that speak over 7 languages. And so we have in-house expertise and provisions and supports for these families. And what I've learned working with the caseworkers from DCPP and other service providers how much I love this work. There's no adversarial quality to it. It's a commitment and partnering to serve these families. We're dedicated to make sure that they're supported. It's strength-based. It's not about whether their children should be somewhere else. It's about what can we do for you so you feel that you can serve your families the best and thrive.
Thank you. That's wonderful. One other of our audience questions asks specifically about parents who decline to talk to the CASA assigned to their case, even when the CASA is trying to help them and support the family's reunification. Do you have any suggestions about how to engage such a parent? And secondly, wants to know the appropriateness of CASA, in your opinion, of contacting parents or even law guardians, if you have an answer for that, so that the CASA can understand all the points of view.
So I can speak for my cases. I'm thrilled when CASA reaches out to me specifically. So my suggestion is to see if you can actually speak to their attorney if they're represented. And I find, anyone who's looking to hear from my client, from my parent, and want to advocate for them and coming in generally with, a heart saying, I'm trying to do best for this child, and I think the parent needs some support, and I want to know what I can do for the parent. And if I'm receiving that messaging, I'm absolutely supportive of that connection. I know there are concerns, as you can imagine, our parents are faced with so many providers and interveners and interventions of whether or not they're good enough, right? Whether or not, assessing them not to get their child back, but actually how to keep them apart is how they feel and often are treated. Some of the system fails that I talked about. And so in knowing that, I think that if a parent, and as I hear from parents time and time again, when they feel and see that someone is empathetic and compassionate and is looking to fight for them, they'll respond to that. They know that the more allies they have is how children are returned and how they can get their family back together. So my recommendations, of course, reach out to their attorney, and hopefully that will be received, that message. But also think about why parents may be distrustful and uncomfortable and concerned, because time and time again, this happens. They're failed by everyone else looking in while they're in fighting for their lives. So it's not personal. It doesn't mean that they don't want to talk to you or hear from you. They want to make sure that you're there to support them and on their side, and that this will make an effective difference. I've definitely had clients say, what are you going to do for me? What's the point of you? When I was a public defender and even now. And I have to make sure they see my warrior cry every time and battle through. If they don't, then they won't feel supported.
One other of our attendees asked about the right of children to see their siblings who are also in placement but not living with them. Can you answer that question?
The cases where I've represented youth parents, and there's a few of those, and that's something very important to me, or pregnant youth, is that they do look to their siblings, and sibling connections are critical during this traumatic time. And like I said, I read the law that siblings are expected to see each other and have contact and family connections, and that should be supported and encouraged. And we need to be creative about it. If children are in different placements, that's not their job to figure it out. It's our job to figure that out. And I've seen creative things, and where you can use kin and other community members to make that happen. It can occurring. Also, I know now virtually things happen much more easily and are much more accessible. My youth clients are constantly schooling me on what to do and what's more effective than using the phone or texting or FaceTime. There's much better ways to have meaningful ties. And so my position is should be encouraged. We should challenge ourselves to make sure it happens. And that should be raised often.